Good morning. My name is Pierre-Henri de MENTHON. I am editorial director at Challenges. Welcome to this session in the cool of the morning, where the theme of the meeting is dealing with clashes. There's one clash which we're encountering. It's quite foreseeable. It's less foreseeable than others. It's the demographic clash with populations in different parts of the world, in most parts of the world, are going to see their demographics shrinking in coming years, decades, and centuries apart from in sub-Saharan Africa. So we are going to face the problem of aging, and that's what we're going to be talking about this round table. I'm immediately going to hand the floor to our economist. We've got Pauline Rossi with us. She is a professor at the Polytechnic School, and she has just joined the Economic Analysis Unit, which works with Matignon in Paris. The floor is yours. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So funding, aging, and dependency is a basic economic question. We have to transfer wealth over time. So you create wealth when you're young, you create less wealth when you're older. And given that consumption and production do not take place at the same time, there is an inherent risk. All kinds of things can happen in the meantime, which are independent of ourselves. So the idea is, how do we organize that transfer of wealth to reduce said risk? And all individuals face this question, no matter what period of time they live in or what their society is. So this transferal boils down to the people I know, my children, the people I know. When I generate wealth, I give it to those people who are in need. And I hope the day when I need wealth, they will give it to me. So this is a system which is based on trust in others, trust in future generations. But I'm linked to it all, of course. The problem with this system is that it does not share out risk sufficiently. The number of people upon whom I can count is very limited. And so there are many elderly people who are impoverished because their family is unable to support them. To combat this poverty among the elderly, we have gradually expanded the circle so that there will always be young workers producing wealth, and that wealth can in part be transferred to previous generations, even though they're not directly linked to them. And so at the end of this movement, we have reached this system, this pension system, which is nationwide. And it's based on trust in the other, but however, the other is a more abstract concept. The advantage of the system is that we've smoothed out the risks. We have reduced inequalities between individuals in the same generation. However, we have introduced a further risk, a new inequality between generations, because the size of the cohorts changes over time, and the number of those people who don't work compared to those who do will change also. So the question there is, what is fair? Is it fair for each generation to receive the same amount per head, or should each generation give the same amount per head, per capita? So in that case, generations with more people in it are favored because they give less, and the opposite is true also. So equality on one side can create inequality on the other, and that's a kind of an infinite problem. So the alternative is to say, let's change the mindset where each generation depends on the following generation and make sure that every generation depends on itself. And we need to have financial tools which will enable us to transfer wealth over time. So let's use those tools. So the first problem with this approach is that we are reintroducing inequality within one and the same generation, because depending on what you've saved when you were working, and depending on your health when you are no longer working, then you could quite easily find yourself in a situation where you haven't got enough money. And the second problem, which is not always well understood, is that this is also a system that is based fundamentally on the new generation, the next generation, because financial yield depends on business world, and that depends on demographics. You buy an apartment, for example, and you say that that's going to boost your pension, but then the real estate market tumbles because there's too much supply compared to demand, and then your investment will not give you as much yield as you had imagined. And so the real difference is that you are more limited You could invest in another part of the world. For example, the French investment fund could invest in Pakistan, which is going to grow in the next decade. So that's an advantage because you've got more options. You could diversify your economic risks. However, the downside is that you've got less control and you're introducing a geopolitical risk, because the day that Pakistan decides to add a tax to any capital which is extracted, then you're dumbfounded. And so that's the way I would describe the problem in theory. But at the end of the day, we have to say that maintaining your lifestyle when you stop working boils down to a miracle, really. Because of demographics and economics, if they're favorable, then you'll be fine. But as we're going to see with our panelists, that is not the case today. So allow me to introduce to you the different participants just very briefly. Next to you is Sarah CARLSON. You are Vice President, Sarah, Senior Vice President of Moody's. And you are going to give us a quick overview of the world, because the world cannot be resumed as the country of France. There's much more in the world than France. Your neighbor is called Gilles, BÉNÉPLANC, who is a key figure in the insurance world. You are going on to the FNAC stand because you have written a book about insurance, and you'll be signing that with Pierre-Henri, who is well known in France. So you know the subject very well. You are Chief Executive Officer of the Adélaïde Groupe. So Berlin Brokers is the umbrella company. So by you've got Nick DUSSUYER, who speaks French, although is Australian. I think he's going to talk to us a little bit about how pensions are funded in Australia. And you are CEO of WTW here in France. The name of the company has changed several times and is about to change again because you've got many stakeholders. And also we've got Sylvain, RABUEL, who is the chair of a major group that works with the elderly. You have a lot of establishments, retirement homes throughout Europe, and you are one of the top 3 companies in that field. So you will be talking about how we fund dependency. So we've got a very complete panel covering several countries and aspects of this subject. So Sarah CARLSON, could I invite you to take a few minutes now to give us an inventory state of the situation? France, as I've just said, is not the only country facing demographic problems. In Italy, the situation is even worse. So where are we? What are governments doing? What are social partners doing around the world? What systems are being set up to fund all of this? Sarah understands French, but she's choosing to speak in English, so use your headset if you'd like to listen to the French translation.
When I think about aging cost, I think about 2 things, and that's how my colleagues and I at Moody's think about it. It's not just about the euros that the state pays out, though I'll come in and talk about that in a minute. It's also what the impact of aging is on economic growth, because economic growth is something from the standpoint of government debt, it makes problems easier to deal with. And from that, I have good news, because France actually has significant advantages that it's not leveraging right now. So it has the potential to be able to do more, because French demographics for an advanced economy are actually pretty good. All advanced economies are aging, but the situation France is in is materially better than that of Italy, for example, which you mentioned, Germany, to go further afield, Japan. The other thing that people don't necessarily think about as often is that in France, the number of healthy years someone has after the age of 65 is one of the highest in Europe. The highest is in Sweden, but in France, the average person can expect to have about 11 healthy years after the age of 65. That makes it easier for people to have longer working lives, for example. But what we see is that France is not making the most of these advantages. because if I compare the French to the average European, the French exit the labor market far earlier, 62.6 years, according to the European Commission. What we see elsewhere, Denmark, the average person exits the labor force at the age of 65. And I can hear what some of you are probably thinking, like, oh, it's the Nordics. The Nordics always behave differently, but that's not true. Actually, in Southern Europe, you see something actually very similar. In Spain, Portugal, Greece, people also exit the labor force over the age of 64. What France's behavior is in this respect is much more like an East European country. But in Eastern Europe, the number of healthy years the average person can expect to have is far, far lower. So this is an advantage that's sitting here. And that, frankly, France, with the highest healthcare costs as a percentage of GDP in Europe, France has paid for this with its world-class system of healthcare and focus on prevention. So that's good news. And that's something where if it were to change, it could have an important impact on growth. But of course, we can also think about the cost in terms of euros. I am a sovereign economist, so I think about everything in terms of the percentage of GDP, because that makes it easier to compare one country to another. And in that, I've got good news and bad news for you first. And I'll give you the bad news first, so we can end on a high. The bad news is that French public pension costs are high. They remain high. But the good news is that they're not actually increasing that much, and that France becomes less of an outlier as time goes on. So if we think about 2040, in 15 years' time, France, which is now spending 14.2% of its GDP on public pensions, will be spending 14.1% of its GDP. Right now, only Austria is at a similar level. Italy is actually materially higher at 16.1. But France will have more company in 2040, where we'll see countries like Belgium, Austria stays there, Portugal will all be spending about the same amount as France. We'll have Spain and Italy actually spending more. As I said earlier, when it comes to healthcare spending, France spends more than anyone else in Europe, and it'll continue to spend more. But I say that's actually buying France some significant advantages that it could actually leverage to help the economy grow more quickly. A big uncertainty with regard to healthcare is what happens with technology and how technology increases or decreases healthcare costs. That's something that remains to be seen. But from where we stand, as I say, it costs a lot in France, but it's something that France is actually gaining significant advantages from, potentially in the future if it chooses to use them.
Merci beaucoup. Alors,
Thank you very much. I was surprised because there's quite a lot of good news there in your message, which is quite a contrast with some of the reports the Cour des Comptes in France has published, and the IMF is... Gilles, can I turn to you, please? We've been talking about France here. You heard that fabulous audit of our healthcare system and our pension system. So what's your vision? You've been in the kitchen for a long time. You know what's cooking. Well, coming back to what Sarah's been talking about, GDP amounts, and the Cour des Comptes report says 14% of GDP. They're saying there's going to be a slight increase. But that does not solve the issue, because you need to fund that percentage of GDP. And the problem today is that we're facing a brick wall in terms of financing. I'd just like to give you one single figure. If we do nothing, in 2045, we will have increased our debt by 400 billion euros, 300 billion for the general regime and 100 billion for the territorial funds, etc. So The issue is, how do we fund all of this? I'd like to make 2 comments, and I'm sure my colleagues will react to them. First comment, I think that we have moved forward in our conversation because now we're getting some realistic figures. For years, there were reports being published that were full of all kinds of imaginative figures, etc. But now the reports are more factual. Before, the figures were false. Now they are accurate. And so we were procrastinating in the past. One thing that needs to be done today is, well, something. We need to act. We need to start to solve this solution rather than wondering what the right way to tackle the problem is. So that's the first comment. My second comment is, we're talking about capitalization of private regimes. These private regimes are very useful. They're very virtuous because they attract into the saving sphere youngsters. That being said, the funding problem is not going to be solved by private capitalization. We really need to take a look at that general system. Capitalization is great, but it is not going to solve the problem of the other type. So let's go round the table to find some solutions later on. So for the problems, Nick, what is your point of view on the problems? Well, thank you very much. Hello, ladies and gentlemen.
Half full rather than half empty. Donc moi, je suis plutôt du positif. Donc j'étais content d'en prendre justement un.
So I'm very happy to hear this positive message because there are solutions which exist. We will be talking about them later on, but before, let's talk a little bit about the observations and the problems. We're going to talk about the demographic clash. We talked about it briefly, and we're talking about it in generally here. About 50. In 2040, 15% of the population will be over 75, so there'll be over 10 million people. There'll be 1 in 4 French will be over 65, and it will be difficult to keep people at home. 65% of the French want to age at home, and funding is short. And the different types of residences that need to be adapted, there aren't enough of them. We need medical facilities. There are a certain number of rooms ready today, 40% only. We need to have 1 million in the next 5 years. And so how do we fund all of this kind of sheltered accommodation? So that needs to be looked at with 3 million people who are going to be are dependent today, depending on help from others for their daily life. So the figures are going to go up as people age, and the lifespan is going to aggravate the situation. So this status quo is untenable. We've seen that in terms of funding this year with the report, this week with the report, but it's not enough to fund dependency. You have to prepare for it and accompany it. So the key question today is that of balance between individual responsibility and collective solidarity. So do we encourage each individual to prepare, to save, to anticipate risks for themselves, or do we organize a team response? Do we pool everything in society? And I believe Gilles mentioned this quickly. I think these 2 mindsets are complementary, but you have to work out how to make them sit side by side. So how far do we go with national solidarity, given the tensions today, and increasing demographics? And how can we guarantee the different generations between workers, retired, the carers, and those people who need the care? So I lived in Australia for 22 years. Very early on, this country decided to have an obligatory complementary pension. The company had to contribute 12% of gross salary into a private pension fund. And in 92, the figure went up, and it created long-term products which would include dependency, which would cover dependency. What about lack of autonomy? Now, may I just butt in here? We're going to talk about the solutions later on. It's fabulous, the Australian model, but for the time being, I'd just like to come back to those figures, those scary figures about dependency. So we've got a specialist here, one of the leaders in this sector with us today. Could you, I think there's a fifth branch of social security which is supposed to be taking care of this. The problem is that it has no money. Could you just give us a quick update on the situation in terms of dependency and the very elderly? Yeah, of course I can. I'm not going to repeat what has already been said. But my first comment is that in the next 10 years, we know that the country is going to change. 20% of the population will be over 65, so there'll be more elderly people. There'll be more people over 65 than under 25. That will be the first time we've ever been in that situation. That will also weigh on our entire healthcare system, on the pension system and public funding. My second comment is that France today devotes 30 billion euros per year via health insurance to helping the very elderly and caring for the dependent. And that is a substantial amount of money. There's a fifth branch, a fifth risk which has been created for loss of autonomy. And to cope with this risk tied in with demographics and longer life cycles, this is not being funded. It hasn't got any funding earmarked for it. So it's just part and parcel of healthcare insurance. And the problem is that this 30 billion in structural terms is already not enough to cope with the needs of the elderly who are in France alive today, because they have been defined by a law which was designed 25 years ago. In that space, 25 years, the profile of the elderly dependent people here in France has modified. People are much older, they have a lot more illnesses, and in 25 years there's been a massive emergence of cognitive illnesses, Alzheimer's, Parkinson, etc. So the funding system for the elderly dates from 25 years ago, but today the targeted public is not the same. They're not the same number of people, they don't suffer from the same illnesses. That's why regularly you will hear us talking about a crisis in the area of medicalized care homes for the elderly, because these establishments are taking care of a population which is much older, much iller, much more ill than the budget imagined they were going to be. And to finish on this point, I would say that one imagines in the next 10 years, we'd have to add 20 or so billion euros to the 30 billion to cope with all of these changes. And the final point I want to underline, because it's very important, and I'm sure it will speak to people in the room, to this 30 billion, we have to add all of the work which is given free by family carers. Yes, we do quantify that. We can quantify it. Yeah, for this roundtable, I've done that calculation. It will be interesting for Pauline to take a look at this in the summer. I'm sure she's much better at calculations than I am. But there are about these 20 million helpers, carers in France, and 2/3 of them work with an elderly person, usually a parent. So 6 to 7 million family carers work with the elderly. And if we take the fact that they spend 10 hours per week caring to that elderly person, that's not very much, 10 hours. It's about an hour or just over an hour per week. And if you say that each hour is worth 23 euros, that's a basic fee. And you multiply that by 40 or so weeks in the year, because the family carers do have the right to go on holiday, then you arrive at amounts which are absolutely humongous, in the region of 50 billion euros of work which is provided free by family carers. So the 30 billion we've got provided by health insurance, you have to add to that at least the same amount, if not more, free work provided by family carers. And let's not forget that, sociologically speaking, the family carers are going to diminish in number in France and in Europe, because, of course, people are becoming more individualistic, because people are moving to different parts of the country. You may not live in the same town as your parent, and because families are splitting and being recomposed by that. So it means that you might have less help at hand. So these pillars, these invisible pillars, will be eroded over the next 10 years. These visible pillars ties in with what Pauline was talking about, the family solidarity, which was the very basis at the get-go. Solidarity from the family. I'm not sure if the students and the different academies are doing the calculations, but it does beg the question of labour, which does exist, but which is not paid. So then it begs the question, you should talk about that. So this is a thrilling subject. We could spend all day talking about it, of course. It's a vast subject, but for the next few minutes, we'll perhaps go round our panellists once again to identify the solutions this time. So we've really sketched out the problems. I'm going to hand the floor to Pauline, first of all, to see what kind of solutions can be dreamt up, and then Sarah can shed light from different countries. But it's difficult to compare different countries, of course, but you can draw inspiration from models which exist. So Pauline, I'm handing the floor over to you. Okay, in theory, the best way to manage risk is to diversify. The optimum system will always be a combination of different components. So we've already started to talk about them. First of all, we've got the sharing out side, which guarantees a minimum revenue and will cover any catastrophe. So that's solidarity, where any moment in time, the workers in society collectively decide, and in proportion of their revenue, to make sure that the old people don't fall into poverty, and so that they have enough money to survive. That's solidarity. And then there is something which we can add to that, and that depends on each person's individual career. It can be organized by the employer, for example, but in a collective manner, and that's part of remuneration, and it enables people to maintain a certain level of life, quality of life, when they are no longer working. And then there's a private sector which can add a further layer with individual saving and support from family members. The sport historically has always been there, and it hasn't disappeared yet. We've just simply added other elements to the mix. So support can be a helping hand, or it can be financial. I think everybody agrees with that. But then the devil is always in the details, and the question is knowing where we place our cursor between the public and the private sectors, and that, I'm sure, is what we're going to be talking about. Sarah. So thank you, Pauline. Sarah, perhaps you can take stock of the systems in Europe, but not only in Europe. You can perhaps travel further afield. Which systems could inspire us here in France? Because we're having difficulty financing aging.
Preface this by saying that we don't make policy recommendations at Moody's, but given that this is one of the biggest challenges facing all advanced economies, it's not often as a credit analyst I get called glass half full, but have no doubt, this is a huge challenge facing many countries. So we see many kinds of solutions. And if you think about ways in which people can be kept in the labor force for longer, again, this is highly complex. Some of this is completely outside the realm of policy. It's interesting to note that one of the best predictors of when a woman will retire is actually when she becomes a grandmother. Interesting trivia, but something that countries have done across Europe that reduces political risk is they've created statutory links between longevity and the retirement age. You see this in Italy, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, the Netherlands, Greece, Portugal, Spain. These adjustments can still be politically challenging, but it significantly reduces political risk. There can also be things around lifelong learning and training, but there can also be issues of just creating disincentives to push older workers out of the labor force. When it comes to knowledge work, there's actually very little evidence that would say that knowledge workers become less productive as they become older. And as far as adopting new technology goes, that's something that, again, can be done with thoughtful training. But when we look at pension costs, again, which are substantial, we're talking now over 14% of GDP every year in France. That's going to continue. As I say, it's not going to increase the way it does in some places. Changing that trajectory can take a long time. There are some quick wins that you see in some countries that can include changes to indexation, increase in contribution rates, but oftentimes these quick wins are something that are really only politically possible in times of economic crisis. What you see in other cases are slower burning, but they can have a material impact. And that can include things like bringing in some kind of defined contribution, notional defined contribution. And to give you an example, I'll give you Italy. So during the government of Mario Monti, which was in power during 2011 to 2013, Italy enacted a massive pension reform. One of the things that they did is link the retirement age to the indexation age, but they also introduced this concept of notional defined contributions, which is something that does have a positive impact on the public finances. But it starts to decrease these costs, as I said earlier, in 2037. And there's a transition period that is still quite expensive. So I would say the solutions that we see that have the biggest and most enduring impact, that are the least politically challenging, also take a long time to actually show up in the numbers.
Merci beaucoup, Sarah. Donc, l'exemple italien. Donc,
Thanks a lot for providing us with some information about the Italian example. So the impact will start in 2037, and we haven't yet sorted out all the problems and issues. I cut you short, but can you revisit the Australian system? Is it applicable to France? Because the rate of mandatory taxes is quite high. So if you ask French people to contribute more in terms of taxes, it would be difficult. But this is the Australian system. Yes, of course. But they started at an earlier time, so it was a gradual process. We will be talking about that, capitalization, pooling. You have other avenues, pooling, prevention, the role of the elderly people. But if you consider this system, this is the system that is applicable to other countries. What is the rate? 12%. Yes, it started at 3%, then up to 12%. It's huge, isn't it? Yes, the savings rate for French people is very high. It's about 16%. In terms of income. So this has to do with insurance, life insurance. This is a profidency elements. What could be the avenues that we could be exploring in a realistic way? You have to consider the political context all the countries are facing this issue. I'm not going to talk about the conclave of pensions, but what solutions could be advocated? Which recommendations could you give to a government? Whatever the type of a government, I don't know if I would give some recommendations to a government. The 12% rate is high, but if you look at the payslip of French people, so you have 28% duty as against 18. Yes, but it adds up. But with the 28% duty, you can use capitalization tools. So 2 observations. The hybrid system is the solution that we need to foster. This is what Pauline told us together with the other speakers. So the private system is there, 7 million people who have a pension-driven contract, and the outstanding payments are about 100 billion. It's not a lot given what is at stake, but that's a starting point. So if you put a little bit of capitalization in the general scheme, it will be good, but we need to start. And to get started, you need a virtual shock in order to get some money, to release some funds. This could be envisaged, but what is important is to settle the short-term problems and issues. To do so, look at the report of the Court of Auditors. So those who contribute will have to pay more, and to reduce the indexing rate for pensions. It's complex because we know that the elderly people vote. If you look at the pension fund, the general pension fund, there's under indexing rate worth 2% or 3%, and nobody complained about that. And then there are two other issues: the retirement age, with a fast effect that will be reduced over time, and then you have to consider the number of years. So we can't say that there's an all-encompassing solution. There's an array of solutions. And there's a third issue to consider: the 10% discount. This is a taboo topic because we know that pensioners, they vote more than the other voters, but there's a consensus. Pauline, correct me if I'm wrong. Jean-Hervé Lorenzi, who is a specialist in this field, has said that there are some millions of euros that could be collected, and they could be reinjected into the pension reform. I'm talking about income tax. Not everybody pays income tax in this country. Second observation, we've been talking about funding, but what about the assets and the active people? There are two schools of thought. First school of thought, capitalization has to be invested as best as possible. So it's important to turn to the global financial markets, especially in the US, in order to get the best yields. This is the funding strategy of the reserve fund for pensions. And the second school of thought, you have savings. The Europeans, they save a lot. Money that is being saved should remain in Europe and should be earmarked to the main transitions: climate transition, digital transition, demographic transition. Allow me to take stock of the solutions of the fifth branch. It's just a branch that has started to work. What could be the realistic solutions to this kind of iceberg that is looming large at a time when public finances are high in terms of financing? Many things have been said. We need to improve the yield of the current financing. Insurance health system, I was talking about 30 billion, but I'm not quite sure that the 30 billion euros are being used properly. But silo-based funding, you have home and care assistance funding, and we could pool HR related pension schemes. All the care related jobs are undermined by temporary work, by temping work, which is more costly than permanent contracts, and this erodes current funding. In all likelihood, we should overhaul the value systems between temporary work and permanent contract work in order to earmark resources to permanent contract work, because it will be more efficient. So we could spend more efficiently. In terms of offer, how are we going to use those resources? Today, in France, I think that there will be a crisis of supply. In 2030, generations who were born after World War II as of 1945, and they will reach 85, i.e. they will need to get some home assistance. They will be in medical residences. There are 6,000 beds in the home cares in France, and they will be glutted in 2030, and will be suffering from a shortage of 1,000 care homes in 2013. And these care homes are not being built, they are being closed. The association-based private sector is closing beds together with the public sector, which is also closing beds. So there will be a crisis regarding the supply of beds. What could be the solution? General mobilization in order to provide supply of beds, supply of assistance. And the only solution is to turn to private capital, because there are some private companies which will be ready to create some supply. But private capital is governed by lots of uncertain regulations. So general mobilization is important to reverse a trend, because in 2030 there might be a massive crisis of supply. French people who would need to be assisted at home or who would need to live in a medical residence, and these supply of offers won't exist. So Nick, you wanted to react, and then Pauline will conclude. In order to echo what Gilles said and Sylvain said, there are 4 solutions. Capitalization, for example, we could have a salaried dependency account. It can be mandatory or on a voluntary basis. So adjustable annuity over time. So at the start you have less, and in the future you will get more. Regarding pooling, we could implement a collective dependence contracts or schemes, and the companies can help. We helped many companies with simple solutions, viably that are economically viable. So we could have a dependency national fund akin to the fund for natural disasters in order to earmark the existing contributions. And the third avenue is prevention, to work upstream to mitigate risks. So prevention should become central from a we need to focus on prevention. We need to adapt the providence accounts, and we could have individual prevention plans with some points that you can aggregate with some possibilities to adapt at the end of the career of the employees. And technology. Here we've been talking about technology, AI, in terms of prevention. So embedded AI in daily objects to detect at an early phase the diseases. These are tools that can expand autonomy in order to focus on prevention. We've talked about the elderly and the carers. These are invisible people. They should be better acknowledged. When we talk about carers, they should be better protected. We know that there will be loads of elderly people, especially in 2030, and these people will be carers, and this will disturb their life balance. You have what we call time savings account for the carers, specific care, dedicated hotline, assistance schemes. So there are some companies that have done that, but they could do more. So Pauline, can you summarize the debates? What are the solutions? So you have a public finance that is very low, capitalization schemes that bring about inequalities. How can we combine the two systems? By way of conclusion, 2 things. First thing, regarding private-public element, private doesn't necessarily mean more sustainable. There are lots of uncertainties regarding the economy of the future. It is connected with demographics. Public doesn't mean more egalitarian, because you have some inequalities across generations because of demographics. Regarding France now, the only thing that I would like to mention is that the poverty rate is twice as high for children as for the over 65. The children represent the economy of tomorrow, and in terms of equity, the children are less responsible for their lifestyle than the elderly people. So if you consider the current system, national solidarity gives too much clout or weight to the elderly. So I guess that there will be some reactions in the audience. There will be a roving mic. Short questions, please, so that we can get as many questions as possible. I'm an entrepreneur, a humanitarian, an inventor, and I represent Silver Valley, the 300 companies investing in this silver company. And I was in charge of the Medical Research Institute, and I asked the question to INSEE, what about the pool of donators at the end of 2015? They told me that there would be more people aged 60 than people aged 20. So there was a kind of tipping point. So you have, I was worried about dependency, and we wanted to know how to go about it. And we've found some niches, specific funds. You had 7 billion euros in some specific funds, and there were 50% of devaluation. And the auditors said that you have succession rights, and you have the 40 billion at the end of the day. So my question is, isn't there any niche? That's great what you've said. Of course, there are some solutions, and you explored them, and especially with the unclaimed funds. So the niche, this is an interesting concept, but there's another avenue. Henri Emmanuel was at the consignment and deposit office. He was talking about annuities. We have lots of property assets. So what are the niches? And of course, we need to better manage health expenditure. So what are the niches? And of course, there's a lot of research on this field, and André Masson worked a lot on the different terms to liquefy or cash in the assets of elderly, and especially the property assets. He worked on anticipated sales, and this work is important, and we should conduct some experiments in the different regions, because the non-liquid net worth at the end of life is a topic. It's a challenge. In many cases, you don't have other liquidities. So I do subscribe to this idea. There's a need to work on the liquidity, and we've got research, and we need to move ahead with that. Regarding dependency, this is you can sell the flat of your grandmother so that you can pay for the care home, and it is even institutionalized in the public sector. You have some property assets that are mobilized to help the elderly. So you have associations as well. So to get your assets liquidated, why not? But you need to come up with another term. But that's an avenue. But there's a paradox in France. It does exist, but for the most modest people, for people who can get some income support, you can have a succession element. So people will look at your net worth, at your assets. It's a little bit complex to do that. Yes, you're right. Today, the most modest people, the state will target their assets, net worth, to fund income support or social incentives. This is applied to the most modest people, but there is no system to target the net worth of people who could contribute to the system. There's another area of research for your students, and there are some solutions that we can tap. We were talking about assessment of successions, and there are huge niches, and you know that the net worth of old people is increasingly higher. So we need to think about the impact on the property market. Thanks a lot. Agnès Renard. I'm an entrepreneur in a company called Science, Society and Health. Allow me to put to you a question about prevention. Some of you touched upon prevention. I believe that as a health expert, we should slow down the arrival in dependency. What does it mean? It's important to have a better health path, health journey, but it's important to focus on public-private partnership. The state doesn't have enough money to be allocated to prevention. Isn't there be an avenue in order to slow down the number of people who will become dependent? You're right. You can prevent the prevalence of cognitive diseases through a better lifestyle, healthy lifestyle, fitness activities, and it's important to have an intense social and intellectual life. And it's a threefold approach. When it starts early, it's good. And when you sustain that over the whole, it's good. And that's why you can maintain the activity of older people. So in France, we pit the pensioners against active people, but we can also use the employment pension element. So you can remain an active person even though you don't have any more a salaried job. In terms of prevention, after you left the labor market, we could organize a process whereby people could remain active, because when you are 65, you are still fit, and people should remain active for the community, for the good of the community, because it's the best way to prevent aging. So when people stop working from a physical viewpoint, from an intellectual viewpoint, this will affect the less privileged social categories, professional categories. So what is important is to make sure that people remain active socially and intellectually after 65 years of age. Thanks a lot. I'm the moderator, timekeeper. I'd like to thank Pauline and I'd like to thank all the speakers. Don't hesitate to continue our discussions. I think that you will sign in your book at the FNAC stand if you want to know everything about insurance. I mean, don't hesitate to buy this reference book. Thank you.